The barn smelled of decay and forgotten hay. Fog rolled through the open doors like something alive swallowing the March twilight whole. A single lantern swung from a rusted chain overhead, its flame dancing against the splintered walls. Outside, a mounted rider sat motionless, rifle balanced across his lap, watching the muddy road that snaked back toward Wildflower. Inside, Tahoma knelt on one knee in the dirt. His buckskin shirt, fringed at the shoulders, hung damp from snowmelt. A Colt revolver rested in its holster at his hip, and a bone-handled hunting knife sat snug against his belt. His black hair, cut short without braids, framed a face marked by a scar running from temple to jaw, a cavalry saber's gift from 2 winters past. His dark eyes stayed fixed on the figure bound before him. She sat tied to a weathered post, wrists wrapped tight with hemp rope, ankles lashed. A burlap sack covered her head, completely knotted at the neck. The sack moved with her desperate breathing, rough weave clinging to her face as she gasped. Her dress, faded calico torn at the hem, was caked with trail dust. Her shoulders trembled. "Please," she said, voice muffled and breaking. "Please open it. I can't breathe." Tahoma reached for the knot. His fingers worked quickly, loosening the rope. He expected a spy someone Coulter or Maddox had sent to bait him into ambush. He'd tracked this woman 3 days, following whispers that the former telegraph operator knew something about the raid that killed his sister. He pulled the sack away. Clara blinked hard against the lantern light. Her face was pale young, mid-20s perhaps. Brown hair fell loose from its pins. Her blue eyes were wide with fear, but also something harder: determination. Her cracked lips parted. As the sack came free, something small slid from a hidden seam inside the burlap and landed in Tahoma's palm. He turned it over, flat glass wrapped in oilcloth. Carefully, he peeled back the protective layer. A photographic dry plate still undeveloped. But even now he could see faint etching shadows of a field wagon remnants and something small near the edge that stopped his breath cold. A beaded hair tie, red and white beads in a spiral pattern. He'd made it himself years ago for his younger sister Winyan. His hand tightened around the plate. The barn tilted. This small object proved the raid had been staged. Proved Winyan's death was murder, not warfare. The hair tie had been at the massacre site, captured in a photograph that should never exist. Clara watched him, bound hands pressed to her ribs to steady her breathing. "That's why they're hunting me," she whispered. Tahoma's gaze snapped to her face. Instinct moved him. He positioned his body between her and the open door, blocking the rider's view. The protective stance of a warrior trained to shield the vulnerable. He reached for the ropes at her wrists and loosened them slightly, just enough to restore circulation without freeing her. Her fingers were ice-cold, trembling. Outside, the rider turned his horse and melted into the fog without a word. Hooves faded. Time was bleeding away. Wildflower was dying slow. 2 years of drought had turned soil to powder, the creek to a thread of brown water. The livery stable stood hollow doors hanging crooked on broken hinges. The hotel wore boards across its windows like coffin lids. Only the saloon, general store, and Dr. Hart's clinic remained open, serving the handful of stubborn ranchers who'd rather die than abandon their land. The telegraph office was a corpse. Dark windows, sagging wires stretched between tilted poles. Upstairs, in cramped rooms above the depot, Clara had been hiding 2 months. She slept on a bare mattress, with 1 blanket, ate stolen hardtack, and jerky from the storeroom below, spoke to no one. The town believed she was mute, a useful lie that kept questions at bay. Before the drought strangled everything, Clara had run the telegraph. She'd sent ranchers messages, received army dispatches, kept the lines humming between Wildflower and the territorial capital. But last winter, Captain Ezra Coulter arrived with orders to monitor all communications during the frontier conflicts. Tall, 40-something graying hair face like carved granite. He wore his uniform with rigid precision and carried a walking stick with a silver handle that he tapped against furniture when thinking. Coulter ordered Clara to alter messages. Reports of hostile raids were to be exaggerated, locations changed, casualty numbers inflated. When she hesitated, he leaned close enough she could smell tobacco on his breath. Cooperate or I'll have you arrested for aiding enemies of the government. She had no family, no protector. She cooperated. But one night she intercepted a coded message between Coulter and James "Copper Jim" Maddox, the railroad baron, who controlled most land grants in the territory. The message referenced auxiliary actions and photographic documentation. Chirker. Clara decoded it, slowly, hands shaking as understanding crystallized. Coulter's soldiers were dressing as settlers attacking native camps, blaming the Lakota. The fake raids justified military action and let Maddox claim land grants for his railroad expansion. She needed proof. One foggy morning, she slipped into the military camp outside town and found the photographer's tent. Silas Rudd, nervous 30-something ink-stained fingers, kept his equipment in locked trunks. She pried one open stole, a single undeveloped dry plate, wrapped it in oilcloth. The plate showed one of Coulter's staged massacres. She hid it inside the lining of the burlap sack she used for supplies, then vanished into the abandoned telegraph office. Tahoma had been hunting Coulter 6 months. His sister Winyan, barely 20 winters, had died in a raid on their winter camp. The army claimed retaliation for stolen horses. But Tahoma found inconsistencies, fresh boot prints that didn't match moccasins, spent cartridges from military carbines, Winyan's hair tie missing from her body. He carried a torn page from an army report that omitted officers' names. He followed every rumor, every whisper, every cold trail that might lead to the man responsible. His right thigh bore a puckered scar where a bullet had shattered bone. It healed poorly, leaving him with a limp that worsened in cold weather. He used a staff carved from ashwood to test uncertain ground and steady himself when pain flared. The limp didn't slow him. It sharpened his focus. When he heard about a mute woman in Wildflower who'd worked the telegraph, he assumed spy or decoy. His plan: kidnap her, trade her to his contacts for information on Coulter's location. But the dry plate changed everything. Dr. Abel Hart lived in a small house behind his clinic. 50s more gray than brown hair, steady hands, despite the weariness carved into his face. His wife died of fever 3 years back, and he'd thrown himself into work treating poor ranchers free when drought ruined their finances. He hated Maddox with quiet intensity because Maddox's land grabs had driven many patients into poverty. Martha Bell taught school in a shed behind the church. 40s, unmarried, sharp eyes that missed nothing. She kept a leather journal recording daily observations, weather patterns, strangers passing through unusual telegraph activity. She'd noticed smoke signals on the eastern ridge last winter, same night the telegraph office closed early. She suspected something wrong, but had no proof. Ephraim Pike farmed rented land from Maddox. Late 40s, drowning in debt after 2 failed harvests. His teenage son, lean, restless 16, had started scouting for Maddox's men to earn cash and save the family farm. Pike hated it, but needed the money. The boy's name was Samuel, and he carried the weight of his family's survival on narrow shoulders. In the barn, Tahoma studied the dry plate by dim light. Clara watched wrists still loosely bound. "I can develop it," she said quietly. "I learned the chemicals working the telegraph depot." They had a small dark room for official photos. Tahoma looked at her. "You speak. When it matters." Her voice was steady despite fear. "The plate shows Coulter's men wearing settler coats to stage the attack. They photographed it to frame your people. He held up the plate. This proves nothing without development. Then we develop it. She met his gaze directly. But we need a darkroom chemicals time. Tahoma pulled his canteen and held it to her lips. She drank carefully, water running down her chin. He steadied it when her hands trembled. The touch was brief, but deliberate. His fingers brushed hers as he pulled the canteen away, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. An understanding that survival might require trust. "Why steal this?" he asked. "Because it's truth." She paused. "And I'm tired of being part of the lie." Outside, a horse whinnied. Tahoma moved to the door, peering through fog. The rider had returned, but 3 more men on horseback waited on the road, now rifles visible in saddle sheaths. One was adjusting something at his belt, dynamite sticks maybe, or extra ammunition. Tahoma made his decision. He wouldn't trade her. He'd protect her, develop the plate. Justice required evidence, not revenge. He'd learned that the hard way, watching his cousin Huxila nearly destroy their band, chasing vengeance that only brought more death. He cut the ropes at her ankles, pulled her to her feet. "We leave now." Clara rubbed her wrists. "Where?" "Dr. Hart. He has what we need." Tahoma checked his revolver 5 rounds and loosened the knife in its sheath. "And he hates Maddox enough to help." "How do you know?" "Because last month, Hart set a broken leg for me after Maddox's men tried to run me down with a wagon." Tahoma moved to the side door. "He didn't ask questions, didn't turn me in. That says everything." They slipped through the barn side door into the corral. Fog was thicker now, rolling off the creek in white waves that swallowed fences and turned the landscape into shapes without edges. Tahoma moved low along the broken fence line staff in one hand, Clara's arm in the other. She followed without hesitation, fingers gripping his coat sleeve. Behind them, boots hit ground. Voices called sharp and angry in the barn. "Where'd they go?" Tahoma pulled Clara behind rotted fence posts. He pressed her down into cold mud, positioned his body to shield her from sight. His revolver was in his hand, thumb on hammer. "Stay low," he whispered. "Don't move." She nodded, cheek pressed to wet earth. Her breath came fast but quiet. One rider appeared at the barn door, silhouetted against lantern light. Heavy-set man in a long duster rifle cradled in his arms. "Check the corral," he shouted behind him. Tahoma aimed at the ground near the rider's feet and fired once. The shot cracked through fog, echoing off barn walls. The rider's horse reared, and the man cursed, struggling to control it. The sound would carry to town, to the bribed sheriff. Even Maddox's men wouldn't risk a shootout if law might interfere, however corrupt that law was. "Fall back," the rider shouted. "Circle around." They retreated into fog. Tahoma holstered his revolver, pulled Clara to her feet. They ran toward cottonwood trees marking the creek. Ground was slick with mud. Clara's worn boots slipped twice. Each time Tahoma caught her hand firm on her elbow, steadying her without breaking stride. At the creek, water ran higher than usual, swollen with snowmelt from the mountains. Tahoma tested the bank with his staff, then waded in. Cold water soaked his leggings immediately. He turned, extended his hand to Clara. "Cross here. It's shallow enough." She hesitated, staring at rushing water. "I can't swim." "You won't need to." He stepped closer, voice dropping. "Trust me." She took his hand. His grip was strong, palm rough with calluses from weapons and leather reins. He guided her into the water, step by step, staff probing the bottom for hidden rocks. Current tugged at her skirt. She stumbled. Tahoma's arm went around her waist, instantly pulling her against his side, holding her steady. "I've got you," he said quietly. "Keep moving." They crossed together, water splashing around them, soaking them both to the waist. On the far bank, they scrambled up into reeds. Tahoma pulled a short rope from his belt and tied it loosely around her wrist, looped the other end around his own. "So, you don't lose me in the fog." "I won't lose you." She said something in her voice that sounded almost like a promise. They moved through reeds in silence, rope connecting them like a lifeline. Behind them, voices shouted in frustration. The riders had reached the creek, but weren't following. The water was too high, too dangerous in the dark. "They'll circle to the bridge," Tahoma said. "We have maybe 20 minutes before they reach town." "Then we run," Clara said. They ran. Dr. Hart's clinic sat at town's edge, small clapboard building with a crooked porch and single lamp burning in the front window. They reached the back door past midnight. Tahoma knocked 3 times. Paws knocked twice more, a pattern he'd used before when needing Hart's help treating injuries away from prying eyes. The door opened. Hart stood there in shirt sleeves and suspenders, medical bag in one hand. He looked at Tahoma, then Clara, then the rope still connecting their wrists. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Sheriff Doolan's been making rounds." They stepped into the small back room Hart used for storage. Shelves lined walls filled with glass bottles, bandages, surgical tools. A wooden examination table stood in the center, lit by a single oil lamp that cast long shadows. Hart closed the door, locked it. "What's this about?" Tahoma unwrapped the dry plate, held it up to lamplight. "This proves the raid on my sister's camp was staged. But it needs development." Hart leaned closer, squinting at faint images on glass. His jaw tightened. "Blast, that's evidence all right." "Can you develop it?" Clara asked. "I know the chemicals. A factory-coated dry plate, the emulsion is already sensitized. It only needs a developer pyrogallic acid or ferrous sulfate and a rinse in hypo to fix a developer pyrogallic acid or ferrous sulfate and hyposulfite of soda to fix. You must have them." Hart nodded slowly. "Silver nitrate for cauterizing wounds. Factory-coated dry plate emulsion for sealing cuts. The others I can substitute from what I have." He looked at Tahoma. "But this takes time. Hour, maybe more. Plate has to be warmed, treated, washed, careful. Rush it, the image is ruined." "How long before Doolan finds us?" Clara asked. "Minutes," Hart said. "Maybe less." A knock sounded at the front door, loud, insistent. All 3 froze. "Open up, Doc," Sheriff Doolan's voice called from outside. "Got questions for you?" Hart moved quickly. He gestured to a narrow space behind a tall cabinet filled with medical charts. "Hide there. Silent as death." Tahoma and Clara squeezed into the space shoulders, pressed together in darkness. The rope still connected their wrists. Clara's heart pounded so hard Tahoma could feel it through her arm. He shifted slightly, positioning himself so if someone found them, he'd take the first bullet. His fingers found hers in the dark and squeezed once reassurance. Hart walked to the front door, opened it. "Sheriff, late for house calls." "Got reports of gunfire at the old barn," Doolan said. Thick-necked man, 50s badge pinned to his vest, revolver holstered low. His eyes were small, suspicious, mean. "You treating anyone tonight?" "Just finished setting a broken finger for one of the Miller boys. Fever's spreading at their ranch, keeps me busy." Hart's voice was calm, practiced. "Haven't heard any gunfire." Doolan stepped inside, boots heavy on floor. "Mind if I look around?" "You got a warrant." "Don't need one if I suspect you're harboring fugitives." Hart sighed. "Fine. Look all you want. Nothing to hide here." Doolan walked through the clinic, opening doors, peering into corners. He stopped in front of the cabinet where Tahoma and Clara hid. His hand rested on the handle. In the darkness, Tahoma's fingers moved silently to the knife at his belt. If Doolin opened that cabinet, if he looked behind it, Tahoma would have to move fast. Kill quick and quiet. He'd done it before, hated it every time. But he'd do it to protect Clara, protect this evidence. Doolin pulled the cabinet door open. Papers and charts spilled out. He grunted, shoved them back without really looking, closed the door. He hadn't checked behind. Satisfied? Hart asked, voice flat. For now. Doolin headed for the front door. But I'm posting a deputy outside, just in case. Suit yourself, Sheriff. The door closed. Footsteps faded down porch steps. Hart waited a full minute before returning to the back room. He's gone, but he meant that about the deputy. We don't have much time. Clara stepped out from behind the cabinet, hands shaking harder now. The fear she'd held back during Doolin's search was hitting her delayed. Tahoma steadied her wrist thumb, pressing lightly against her pulse. Breathe, he said quietly. We're safe. You did well. She focused on his voice, his touch. Her breathing slowed. Hart gathered chemicals and set up a makeshift darkroom in the corner wooden crate, draped with heavy black cloth as a light, tight enclosure. Clara explained the process step by step, voice growing steadier as she focused on the task. First, we warm the plate. Then apply developer, wait for the image to appear. Finally, fix it with hyposulfite of soda, hypo, or whatever you have that's similar. Tahoma stood by the window, carbine rifle in hand, watching the street. A deputy sat on a bench across the road, smoking a cigarette, eyes scanning the clinic's front. Young man, early 20s, looked half asleep, but his rifle was within easy reach. In the kitchen, Hart and Clara worked by candlelight. Clara held the plate carefully, while Hart warmed it over the candle flame, moving it slowly to avoid cracking glass. Their faces were close air between them, thick with concentration. Tahoma watched from the doorway. He saw the way Clara's breath fogged the glass slightly as she leaned closer, the way Hart steadied her hand when it trembled. It was a small moment, practical, necessary. But it carried weight. These were good people risking everything for truth. After 20 minutes, the image began to appear, faint at first, then sharper. Hart used a magnifying glass to examine it closely. Great Scott, he whispered, voice tight. Clear as day. The developed plate showed men in reversed army hats and canvas coats standing near a burned wagon. One man held a rifle with a cavalry-issue strap. In the foreground, near the wagon's wheel, lay Winyon's beaded hair tie, red and white beads, unmistakable. In the background, a horse bore a brand on its flank, a stylized M, with railroad tracks beneath. Maddox's mark. But the men's faces were partially obscured by shadows, coat collars pulled high. They needed more proof. Names, dates, payments. Hart set the plate down carefully. Martha Bell keeps a journal, writes down everything that happens in this town, comings, goings, smoke signals, strange behavior. If the raid happened when you think she'll have the date. Maybe more. Clara looked at Tahoma. And the railroad office has payroll ledgers. If Coulter's men were paid through Maddox's company, there'll be a record. Names, amounts, dates. Tahoma nodded slowly. Then we need both. Journal and ledger. That means going back into town, Hart said. With the deputy watching my door and Doolin's men searching. We'll manage, Tahoma said. He looked at Clara. Can you walk quietly in those boots? I'm not the one with a limp, she replied, a hint of defiance in her voice. He almost smiled. Almost. Fair point. Hart moved to a cabinet, pulled out a dark coat and hat. Take these, Clara. You'll look less like yourself. And take this. He handed her a small Derringer pistol. 2 shots. Point and fire. Don't think, just do it. Clara took the gun, felt its weight. "I've never—" "You have now," Hart said. "Better to have it and not need it than the opposite." Tahoma checked the street through the window. The deputy was lighting another cigarette, attention momentarily elsewhere. "We go now. Fast and quiet." They waited until the deputy changed shifts at 2 in the morning. The new man was younger, less alert, spending most time pacing in front of the clinic rather than watching the alley behind. Tahoma and Clara slipped out through the back door, moved along the alley parallel to Main Street. Fog still clung to buildings. They passed the closed general store, darkened saloon, empty livery. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every sound made Clara's heart jump. Martha Bell lived in a small cottage behind the church shed where she taught. Faint light glowed in her window. Tahoma knocked softly. After a moment, the door opened a crack. Martha's sharp eyes peered out. She wore a nightgown with a shawl over her shoulders, gray hair in a braid down her back. "I know you," she said, looking at Clara. "Telegraph girl. Everyone thinks you're mute." "I was protecting myself," Clara said. "May we come in, please? It's urgent." Martha studied them both. The Lakota warrior with his limp and scarred face, the young woman in borrowed clothes with desperation in her eyes. She opened the door wider. "Quickly." Inside the cottage was small but tidy. A desk sat near the window, covered with papers and books. Martha's journal lay open, handwriting neat and precise. She closed it, looked at Tahoma. "You're Lakota? Huxela's band?" His cousin, Tahoma said. "But I'm not here for tribal matters. I'm here for justice." Martha nodded slowly. "Then tell me what's happening, all of it." Clara explained everything: altered telegraphs, staged raids, the dry plate evidence. She showed Martha the developed image by candlelight. Martha studied it carefully, then turned to her journal and flipped through pages, muttering dates under her breath. "Here," she said, pointing to an entry from 2 winters past. "February 14th, 1876. I noted smoke on the East Ridge, unusual telegraph activity. The office closed early that day. I saw a photographer's wagon leave the military camp just before sunset." She flipped to another page. "And here, March 2nd. Strangers arrived, 6 men with military bearing but no uniforms. They stayed at the hotel 3 days left in the middle of the night. I thought it was odd enough to record." Clara copied the dates onto scrap paper. "This matches the timeline perfectly. If we find the payroll ledger, we can tie Coulter and Maddox directly to the raid." Martha handed her a folded map. "One of my students, Samuel Pike Ephraim's boy, drew this. Shows trails around the ridge and the rail spur office. The ledgers are kept in a locked cabinet, 2nd floor. Samuel mentioned it once when his father sent him to deliver paperwork." She paused. "The boy's been acting strange lately, scared. I think Maddox has him doing things." Tahoma took the map. "Thank you, Mrs. Bell." Martha gripped his arm. "Be careful. Maddox has eyes everywhere. And Doolin won't help you. He's on Maddox's payroll. Has been for years." They left through the back door, headed toward the rail spur office on town's edge. The building was 2-story timber structure with a loading platform and small stable attached. Single lamp burned on the 2nd floor. Tahoma tested the front door. Locked solid. He moved around to the side where a window hung slightly open. He pried it wider with his knife and climbed through, then reached back to help Clara. She gripped his hand, pulled herself up. Her skirt caught on the windowsill. He steadied her waist as she slid through their bodies, pressed close for a moment in the darkness. Inside, the office smelled of ink and sawdust. A clerk's desk sat near the window, covered with invoices and shipping manifests. Tahoma lit a small candle, shielded the flame with his hand. They moved toward the stairs. On the second floor, they found the cabinet, locked with a simple padlock. Tahoma used his knife to pry it open, metal scraping loud in the silence. He froze, listening. No footsteps, no voices, just the wind outside. Inside the cabinet were 3 leather-bound ledgers. Clara pulled them out one by one, scanning entries by candlelight. Her finger traced down pages. "Here," she whispered, voice sharp with discovery. "Payment to private auxiliaries, 6 men, $50 each. Dated February 15th, 1876. One day after the smoke signals Martha saw." She turned the page. Signed by E. Coulter, countersigned by J. Maddox. Tahoma leaned closer. The handwriting was clear, undeniable. This was proof direct financial connection between Coulter and Maddox and the staged raid. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Tahoma blew out the candle, pulled Clara behind a filing cabinet. A clerk entered carrying a lamp, young man, 20s, wearing spectacles and a waistcoat. He set the lamp on the desk, began sorting papers, humming quietly to himself. Tahoma waited until the clerk turned his back and then moved swiftly. He covered the man's mouth with one hand, pressed the knife blade flat against his throat with the other, not cutting, just threat. "Don't shout," he said quietly. "We're not here to hurt you. But if you fight, that changes." The clerk nodded frantically, eyes wide with terror behind his spectacles. Clara stepped forward with a length of wire from the desk. She tied the clerk's wrists behind his back, then secured his ankles to the chair. "We just need the ledger," she said gently. "You'll be found in the morning. You'll be fine." The clerk nodded again, breathing hard through his nose. They took the ledger and climbed back out the window, dropped to ground below. 2 of Maddox's riders appeared at the end of the street, horses moving at a trot. Both men carried rifles across their saddles. "Run," Tahoma said. They sprinted toward the alley behind the church. The riders saw them, spurred horses forward. Hooves thundered on packed earth. Tahoma turned, tipped over a rain barrel. Water spilled across the street. One horse slipped, threw its rider hard. The man hit ground, didn't get up. The other rider cursed, drew his revolver. Clara grabbed a piece of scrap wood from a pile near the church, flung it into the street. The second horse reared, buying them precious seconds. They ducked under a low wagon, bodies pressed together in the cramped space. The remaining rider passed close, so close they could hear his breathing, see his horse's legs through gaps in the wagon bed. Tahoma's chest rose and fell against Clara's back. She could feel the heat of his breath on her neck, the solid strength of him. Their eyes met in darkness, and for a moment neither looked away. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition, connection, and the wordless understanding of 2 people facing death together. The rider circled back, searching. "We need horses," Tahoma whispered. "Livery's empty," Clara said. "But there's a stable behind the rail office. 2 horses, maybe 3. They crawled out from under the wagon, ran back toward the rail spur. The stable was small, only 2 horses inside a bay mare and a gray gelding. Tahoma saddled them quickly, hands, moving with practiced efficiency born of years in the saddle. He helped Clara mount the mare, his hands on her waist, lifting her up, then swung onto the gelding. They rode east toward the ridge, following the map Martha had given them. Behind the riders regrouped and gave chase. One fired a rifle shot going wide, but close enough they heard it whine past. The prairie opened before them, flat and endless under starlight. Tahoma pushed the horses hard, but the pursuers were gaining. They were better mounted, probably on Maddox's best stock. Another rifle shot closer this time. Ahead, smoke rose from the horizon. Tahoma cursed under his breath. Prairie fire. Maddox's men were setting fires to flush them out, drive them into a killing ground. "Stay close," Tahoma shouted to Clara over the pounding hooves. "Follow the dirt ruts. They're packed hard, won't burn as fast as grass." They veered south, riding along an old wagon trail. Fire crept closer, flames licking at dry grass heat building. Clara's horse stumbled on loose rock. She nearly fell. Tahoma reached out, grabbed her reins, steadied the mare without breaking stride. "Hold on," he commanded, voice sharp with authority and fear. She nodded, gripping the saddle horn, white-knuckled. They reached a narrow creek and rode into the water. Horses splashed through cold currents, soaking their legs again. Fire stopped at the creek's edge, unable to cross the natural barrier. They climbed out on the far bank and paused to catch breath. Clara's hands were blistered raw from gripping reins too hard. Blood seeped through torn skin. Tahoma dismounted, tore strips from his shirt, already half ruined, and wrapped them around her palms with surprising gentleness. "You keep too much quiet," he said, tone gruff but touch gentle. "You're hurt," should have said. "You keep too much pain," she replied, nodding at his leg. The limp was worse now after all the running and riding. "Should have rested." He looked at her for a long moment, dark eyes unreadable in the dim light. Then he said, "We rest when this is done." "When will it be done?" "When Coulter faces justice, when Winyon's death is answered for." He finished wrapping her hands. "When people like you stop having to hide and lie to stay alive." "That's a long list," Clara said quietly. "Then we'd better get started." He mounted his horse again, grimacing as his injured leg took weight. They rode on toward the ridge. The canyon was narrow walls, towering on either side, like broken teeth. Tahoma led the way, staff probing rocky ground. Clara followed the mare, picking its way carefully over loose stones. The ledger was tucked inside her dress, pressed against her ribs, the glass plate wrapped and secured in Tahoma's saddlebag. A rifle shot cracked off the canyon wall, sending shards of rock flying. Stone fragments hit Tahoma's face, drawing blood. He pulled his horse to a stop, raised one hand. "Huxila," he called out in Lakota, then switched to English. "It's Tahoma. Hold fire." A figure appeared on the ridge above, man in early 40s, with long black hair and a face marked by old scars. He wore buckskin leggings and a shirt decorated with intricate quill work, and he carried a repeating rifle. Two other warriors flanked him, younger men with bows and carbines. "You bring trouble to our doorstep," Huxila called down in English accent, thick but words clear. "Maddox's riders follow you like dogs on a blood trail. The army watches the ridges. You endanger the band for your own revenge, cousin." "This isn't revenge," Tahoma said firmly. He held up the wrapped dry plate. "This is proof. Coulter's men staged the raids. They killed Winyon to justify their land grabs. They're stealing from everyone, your band, the ranchers, anyone in their way." Huxila climbed down from the ridge, his men following. He stopped a few feet from Tahoma and held out his hand. "Show me." Tahoma unwrapped the plate, held it so light caught the image. Huxila studied it closely, jaw tightening, as he saw the reversed hats, the branded horse, the beaded hair tie. His expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. "This is real," he said quietly. "It's real," Tahoma confirmed. "But we need more. Names, dates, payments. We have a ledger from Maddox's office." He gestured to Clara. "And Martha Bell's journal with timelines. But it's not enough yet." Huxila looked at Clara with open suspicion. "This woman, she's one of them." "She stole the plate to prove truth," Tahoma said. "She's risking her life for justice." Huxila was silent for a moment, weighing judging. Then he said something that changed everything. "The photographer, Silas Rudd, he's alive." Tahoma's head snapped up. What? He's hiding in an old mine shaft 2 miles east, terrified of both sides. Hoxila's voice was flat matter-of-fact. He thinks Maddox will kill him for what he knows. Thinks we'll scalp him for what he did. He's been living like a rat in the dark for weeks. Clara stepped forward. If we can find him, he can testify. He knows everything: who ordered the photos, where they were taken, how they staged the scenes. Hoxila looked at Tahoma. You have 1 day. Bring the photographer and evidence to the federal marshal in the capital. If you succeed, the band supports your testimony. We'll send witnesses protection if needed. He paused. If you fail. He gestured to the plate. I take this by force. Use it our way. Which means war. Tahoma understood. Hoxila wasn't being cruel, he was being practical. If the white man's justice failed, tribal justice would be the only option left. And that meant bloodshed on both sides. Understood, Tahoma said. Hoxila called to one of the younger warriors. Little Crow, you guide them to the mine. Keep them alive if you can. Little Crow, lean and quick, early 20s, nodded and descended the ridge. He wore a simple shirt and leggings, knife sheathed at his belt, carbine slung across his back. His face was young, but his eyes were old. He'd seen things no man that age should see. Move fast, Hoxila said. Maddox's riders are maybe an hour behind, maybe less. They rode east, following Little Crow through a maze of gullies and rock formations. The sun climbed higher, burning away morning fog, baking the land. By midday they reached the mine, an old silver shaft dug into hillside, its entrance half collapsed and overgrown with scrub brush. Little Crow dismounted, called into darkness. Silas Rudd, we're here to help, not hurt. A faint voice answered from inside, high and frightened. Go away, I'm not coming out. You'll kill me. We have the plate you took, Clara called, dismounting. She approached the mine entrance, slowly, hands visible. We know what you did. We understand you were forced. But we need your testimony to stop Coulter and Maddox. Without it, more people die. Innocent people. Silence. Then footsteps shuffled in the darkness. A figure emerged, thin and haggard. Silas Rudd looked 10 years older than his actual age. His clothes were filthy face, gaunt, with hunger eyes sunken. He squinted in sunlight, like he'd forgotten what it looked like. You're the telegraph girl, he said, staring at Clara. They said you were mute. Said you'd gone simple in the head. They were wrong about a lot of things, Clara said. She held up the ledger. We have proof of payments, dates that match. But we need you to testify that Coulter hired you to fake the photos, that you saw the staged raids, that you know it was all a lie. Silas shook his head, backing toward the mine entrance. I can't. If I talk, Coulter kills me, or Maddox, or one of his men. They've got people everywhere. If you don't talk, Tahoma said quietly, stepping forward, more people will die. My sister already has. How many more deaths can you live with? Silas looked at him, then at the plate in Tahoma's hand, then back at Tahoma's scarred face. His shoulders sagged in defeat. All right, I'll testify. But we have to get out of this territory alive first. That's not going to be easy. A low rumble echoed through the mine shaft. Dust sifted from the ceiling like flour. Little Crow looked up sharply. The shaft's unstable. We need to leave. Now. They moved toward the entrance. Yeah. The rumble grew louder, deep, grinding, ominous. The ground shook. Part of the ceiling collapsed behind them, sending rocks crashing down. Tahoma grabbed Clara, pulled her backward, as a heavy beam fell exactly where she'd been standing a second before. He held her against his chest, arms wrapped around her, shielding her as dust filled the air and more rocks fell. When the shaking stopped, they were separated from the entrance by a pile of rubble. Little Crow and Silas were on the other side, coughing in sunlight. "Are you hurt?" Tahoma asked, voice rough with dust and fear. Clara shook her head, still pressed against him. She could feel his heartbeat, fast, strong, alive. "I'm fine, but we're trapped." He loosened his grip but didn't let go immediately. Their faces were inches apart, breaths mingling in dusty air. For a moment, neither moved. Then Tahoma stepped back, scanning the collapsed tunnel. There's always another way out in old mines. Ventilation shafts, drainage tunnels. We find it. Behind them, voices echoed from beyond the rubble. Doolan's men had arrived outside. They heard the sheriff shouting orders, sound of horses, clatter of rifles being readied. "This way," Tahoma said, leading Clara deeper into the mine, away from the voices, and into darkness. The tunnel narrowed until they had to walk single file, hunched over to avoid scraping heads on the low ceiling. Tahoma led the way, staff tapping against walls to test for weak spots. Clara followed, hand resting lightly on his shoulder to stay close in absolute darkness. The air smelled of damp earth, old timber, and something else, sulfur maybe, or mineral deposits. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Tahoma's leg was screaming now, each step sending fire up his thigh. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. They found a side shaft angling upward. Tahoma tested the first handhold, then began to climb. The rock was crumbly, unreliable. Halfway up, it gave way under his weight. He slipped, hands scrabbling for purchase. Clara grabbed his wrist with both hands, bracing herself against the tunnel wall, feet planted wide. "I've got you," she said through gritted teeth, muscles straining. "Don't you dare fall." He found a new foothold, pulled himself up. "Thank you. Thank me when we're out of this hole." They emerged from a crack in the hillside, a quarter-mile from the mine entrance. Below, they saw Doolan and 5 riders searching the rubble. Little Crow and Silas were gone, hopefully escaped, heading east toward the capital to find the federal marshal. Tahoma and Clara stayed low, moving through rocks and scrub. A figure appeared ahead, stepping out from behind a boulder. Samuel Pike, Ephraim's 16-year-old son, rifle in hand. His face was pale, jaw tight. His hands trembled slightly. "Don't move," the boy said. His voice cracked. "Mr. Maddox sent me to watch the trails." Tahoma stopped, raised his empty hands. "Samuel, that's your name, right? Ephraim Pike's son." "How do you know my name?" "Your teacher, Mrs. Bell, told us. She says you're a good student, smart, draws good maps." Tahoma kept his voice calm, non-threatening. "She also says you've been scared lately. I understand why." The boy's rifle wavered. "You don't understand anything." "I understand debt," Clara said gently, stepping beside Tahoma despite the danger. "I saw the ledgers at the rail office. Your father owes Maddox more than the farm's worth, more than he could pay in 10 years. Maddox designed it that way, loans nobody can repay, so he owns everything eventually." Samuel's hands trembled harder. "We need the money. Maddox pays me. Pa's sick from overwork. Ma's trying to keep food on the table. If I don't do what Maddox says, he takes the farm anyway." Tahoma finished. "That's how men like Maddox work. They trap you, then use your love for your family as a weapon." A distant shout interrupted. Dr. Abel Hart appeared on the trail below, riding a mule and waving his arms. "Hold fire," he called. "I'm a doctor. Got wounded men at the creek, need help." Doolan and his men turned toward Hart, distracted. In that moment, Samuel lowered his rifle slightly. His eyes met Clara's, then Tahoma's. "Go," he whispered urgently. Before I change my mind. Before they see. Thank you, Clara said. They ran. At the creek, they found Hart kneeling beside a wounded man, one of Little Crow's scouts shot in the leg during an ambush. Hart was bandaging the wound with strips of cloth torn from his own shirt. Where's Silas? Tahoma asked, breathing hard. Little Crow took him east toward the capital. Hart said, not looking up from his work. But Doolin's men cut them off at the river crossing. They're pinned down. Hoxila's band is holding them off, but it's a stalemate. Nobody can move without getting shot. Tahoma looked at Clara. We need to draw the riders away. Give Hoxila time to get Silas to the marshal. You mean use ourselves as bait? Clara said. Yes. She didn't hesitate. Then let's do it. Hart reached into his medical bag, pulled out a Colt revolver. He handed it to Clara. You know how to use this. My father taught me when I was 12, before he died. She checked the cylinders, 6 rounds, all loaded. She tucked it into her belt. I'm ready. Hart gave Tahoma extra ammunition for his carbine and revolver. Go fast. Don't let them corner you. And for heaven's sake, stay alive. They mounted fresh horses Hart had brought, stronger, faster than the ones they'd ridden before. They rode south deliberately, leaving a clear trail, making noise, making themselves visible. Doolin's men saw them and gave chase, exactly as planned. 5 riders breaking away from the river, crossing thundering after them. The pursuit was brutal. They rode through dry riverbeds, over rocky hills, across open prairie where there was nowhere to hide. The sun beat down mercilessly. One of the riders got close enough to fire. The bullet grazed Tahoma's shoulder, tearing through buckskin and skin. Blood soaked his shirt warm and sticky. Clara pulled her horse alongside his. You're hit. Keep riding, he said through clenched teeth, voice tight with pain. At a narrow ford, they crossed the river. The water was deeper now, swollen by afternoon rains in the mountains upstream. Clara's horse stumbled in the strong current. She tried to hold on, but the water swept her from the saddle. Her skirt tangled around her legs, dragging her down. The current pulled her downstream fast. Tahoma turned his horse, spurred it into the current without thinking. He rode after Clara, leaning down from the saddle. His injured shoulder screamed. He grabbed her arm, pulled her up and onto his saddle in front of him. She coughed up water, gasping. He held her tight against his chest, with one arm controlling the horse with his other hand, and his knees as the animal struggled against the current. Hold on to me, he commanded. She wrapped her arms around him, buried her face against his neck. They made it to the far bank, both soaked and gasping. The horse scrambled up the muddy slope and stood trembling. Are you hurt? Tahoma asked urgently, his arms still around her. No. She coughed again. But the ledger, it's ruined. The leather-bound book had been in her dress pocket. The water had soaked through completely. The ink was running, pages turning to mush. Evidence destroyed. Tahoma cursed quietly in Lakota. Without the ledger, they had less proof. The dry plate alone might not be enough. They needed Silas's testimony more than ever now. Behind them, Doolin's men reached the far bank. They were crossing horses, plunging into the water. We ride, Tahoma said. Now. That night, they camped in a ravine, hidden from the trail. Tahoma built a tiny fire shielded from view by rocks. Clara tended his shoulder wound by firelight. She cleaned it with water from her canteen, then tore strips from her already ruined petticoat and wrapped them around the wound. Her hands were gentle but efficient, pressing firmly to stop the bleeding. You should rest, she said softly. So should you. They sat back to back near the fire, sharing body heat as the temperature dropped. The desert was like that, burning hot by day, freezing cold by night. Neither slept deeply. Both listened for the sound of approaching horses. In the darkness, Clara spoke quietly. "Why did you decide to protect me instead of trading me that first night in the barn? You could have gotten information about Coulter." Tahoma was silent for a long moment. "Because I looked at that plate and realized revenge wasn't enough. The truth mattered more, and you risked everything to bring that truth into the light. And now I protect you because it's right, because you're brave. Because—" He stopped. She turned her head slightly so her cheek rested against his shoulder. "Because what?" "Because I choose to," he said simply. "No other reason needed." She was quiet for a moment. Then her hand found his in the darkness and held it. Not romantic, practical. Connection. Trust. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't answer with words. Just squeezed her hand once briefly, then let go. They sat like that until dawn, two people who'd found each other in chaos and decided to stand together against the darkness. The railroad bridge stretched across the river like a skeleton made of weathered wood and rusted iron spikes. It was a trestle bridge, narrow and old, with gaps between the planks wide enough to see the churning water 20 feet below. Overnight windstorms had battered the territory, and the river was a roaring torrent now swollen with runoff from mountain snow and rain. Tahoma and Clara reached the bridge at dawn. Behind them, the sound of hooves echoed through the canyon, close, getting closer. Doolin's men were minutes away, maybe less. "We cross here," Tahoma said, dismounting. He slapped both horses' flanks hard, sending them across the bridge without riders. The animals' balked ears, flat eyes rolling white with fear. But they ran, hooves clattering on wood, and made it to the far side. "Now us." Tahoma stepped onto the first plank, testing it with his weight. The wood groaned ominously, flexing under him. "Stay close. Step exactly where I step. Don't look down." Clara followed, hands gripping the rope railing so tight her bandaged palms ached. The wind tore at her hair and skirt, cold and vicious. Below, the river roared white foam crashing against support beams, spray rising, everything angry and violent. They moved slowly. Each step was a negotiation with gravity and fear. Tahoma's staff tapped ahead, testing planks. Some were solid, some were rotten. He guided Clara around the worst ones, his hand reaching back to steady her. Halfway across, one of the planks cracked under Tahoma's foot. His injured leg gave out. He stumbled, nearly fell. Clara lunged forward, grabbed his arm with both hands. They clung to each other, faces pressed together, breaths sinking in pure terror as debris from upstream, broken tree branches, pieces of old wagons smashed into the bridge below them. The whole structure shuddered. "Don't let go," she whispered, her lips near his ear. "I won't." He set his arm tight around her waist. They stood frozen like that for 3 heartbeats, then moved forward again together, step by careful step. A bullet whined past Clara's head so close she felt the air displacement. Doolin's men had reached the bridge entrance behind them. They were firing from horseback, trying to hit moving targets on a narrow bridge in high wind. Tahoma pushed Clara ahead of him, shielding her with his body. "Run," he commanded. "Fast as you can. Don't stop." She ran. He followed, limping badly now, but moving. Another bullet hit the railing near his hand, sending splinters flying. 1 more plank to go. 2. They were almost there. The center span collapsed behind them with a sound like the world breaking. Wood and iron crashed into the river, swallowed by white water. The bridge was impassable now. Doolin's men couldn't follow. But Tahoma and Clara weren't safe yet. James Copper Jim Maddox, was waiting at the rail depot on the far side with Captain Ezra Coulter and a dozen armed men. The depot was a large wooden building with a loading platform, water tower, and several rail cars sitting on the tracks. Smoke rose from the chimney, thick black smoke that meant someone was burning something inside. "They're destroying the records," Clara said, staring at the smoke. "The ledgers, the invoices, everything." Tahoma scanned the rail yard. A handcar sat on the tracks. Several horses were tied to a post. Maddox's men were positioned strategically, 3 on the loading platform, 4 near the water tower, the rest inside the depot. "We can't fight them all," Clara whispered. "We don't have to fight them all." Tahoma pointed to the coal room, a small shed attached to the depot. "There's a trap door in there, leads to a drainage culvert. We can get inside." They crawled through the culvert on hands and knees, cold water soaking them again, sharp rocks cutting their palms. They emerged inside the burning depot through a grate in the floor. Smoke filled the air immediately, thick and choking. Flames licked at the walls, eating the old dry wood hungrily. Clara covered her mouth with her sleeve, eyes watering. Through the smoke, she could see Maddox in the office, throwing papers into a pot-bellied stove. Coulter stood nearby, revolver in hand, watching the door. A beam fell from the ceiling, blocking their path forward. Flames roared higher, heat building to unbearable levels. They were trapped between fire and enemies. Clara spotted a stack of crates near a window. "Help me move these. Fast." Together, they shoved the crates aside. Tahoma smashed the window with his staff, clearing the glass. They climbed through, landing hard in the rail yard. Doolin and his men had arrived. They'd found another crossing point and ridden hard. The yard was surrounded now. Doolin's 5 men, Maddox's dozen. Tahoma and Clara stood in the open with nowhere to run. Maddox stepped out of the burning depot, his face flushed with anger and smoke. He was a big man, 50's expensive suit now covered in ash. "You're too late," he said, voice carrying across the yard. "The evidence is ash. The photographer's dead by now. You've got nothing." "Not quite nothing," a voice called from the far side of the yard. Everyone turned. Hoxila rode in with Little Crow, 3 other warriors, and Silas Rudd. Silas was alive, disheveled, but alive. He held up his camera, still intact, wrapped in canvas. "I buried this to protect it," he shouted, voice shaking but determined. "And I remember every photo I took, every name, every date, every lie you told me to document." Maddox's face twisted with rage. "Kill them! Kill them all!" Coulter raised his revolver and aimed at Clara. His finger tightened on the trigger. Tahoma moved without thinking, pure instinct. He dove in front of Clara as Coulter fired. The bullet hit Tahoma's shoulder, the same one that had been grazed before. This time it went deep. He felt hard, blood spreading across his chest. "No." Clara caught him, lowered him to the ground. Her hands pressed against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, Tahoma. Stay with me." His face was pale breath, coming in gasps. But his eyes were focused. He pulled the revolver from his belt with his good hand and pressed it into Clara's palm. "Finish this," he said through gritted teeth. Clara stood, raising the gun. Her hands were steady now, no trembling, no fear, just cold determination. Coulter aimed at her again, adjusting for the kill shot. She fired first. Her bullet hit his hand, shattering bone. The revolver flew from Coulter's grip. He stumbled backwards, screaming, cradling his ruined hand. At that moment, Ephraim Pike stepped forward from the group of riders. He'd followed his son into town, learned what Maddox had done to his family, to so many families. He pointed his old rifle at Maddox. "No more," he said, voice shaking with rage and grief. "You've destroyed this territory long enough. You've destroyed my family. It ends now." Maddox drew his own gun, a Derringer, from his vest pocket and fired without hesitation. Pike fell red stains spreading across his chest. His son Samuel screamed and ran to him, dropping to his knees beside his father. The rail yard exploded into chaos. Hoxila's warriors opened fire on Maddox's men. Little Crow gave a signal. Warriors who'd been positioned around the yard cut the ropes holding Maddox's branded cattle in a nearby corral. The animals stampeded into the rail yard, panicked by smoke and gunfire and shouting. Men scattered, diving for cover. Horses reared and bolted. Maddox ran for the handcar, trying to escape. But the stampeding cattle crashed into it, overturning the heavy car. It rolled iron wheels spinning and crushed Maddox beneath. His scream was cut short. When the dust settled, he wasn't moving. Blood pooled beneath the wreckage. Coulter tried to flee on horseback despite his shattered hand. Clara aimed carefully and shot the reins from his grip. The horse reared, throwing him. He hit the ground hard, didn't get up. Doolin's deputies, seeing their employers dead or captured, seeing federal evidence and tribal witnesses, threw down their weapons. They weren't loyal enough to die for this. Doolin himself tried to assert control, shouting orders. But Dr. Hart appeared with Martha Bell and a group of townspeople who'd followed to witness. Martha held up her journal, reading aloud the entries that matched massacre dates, telegraph closures, suspicious activity. Hoxila hoisted the dry plate high on a pole so everyone could see it. Silas stood on a rail car and shouted names and dates, his voice carrying. Captain Ezra Coulter, James Maddox. Private auxiliaries paid $50 each to stage raids and frame the Lakota. I photographed it all. I have the camera. I'll testify to everything. Before a federal marshal, before a judge, before anyone who'll listen. The townspeople murmured, then shouted agreement. They'd suspected. Now they knew. The truth was undeniable. 2 of Doolin's own deputies arrested Coulter, binding his hands behind his back despite his protests. The captain's face was pale with shock and pain. Samuel Pike knelt beside his father's body, sobbing. Ephraim was still breathing, barely. Dr. Hart rushed over, opened his medical bag. But even from across the yard, Tahoma could see it was too late. The wound was too severe. Ephraim looked at his son and whispered something. Samuel nodded through tears. Then Ephraim's eyes closed. He stopped breathing. Clara pressed harder on Tahoma's wound. "Don't you dare," she said fiercely. "Don't you dare die on me now." "Not planning to," he managed, voice weak but stubborn. Hart finished with Ephraim, closed his eyes, covered him with a coat, then ran to Tahoma. He cut away the bloody shirt, examined the wound. Bullet went clean through, missed the bone. "You'll live, but you'll have another scar." "I've earned it," Tahoma said. As smoke cleared and the chaos settled, the wounded were moved to a makeshift aid station Hart set up using the rail office. Tahoma was carried inside on a stretcher. Clara refused to leave his side. Hart worked quickly, cleaning and stitching the wound, while Tahoma gritted his teeth against the pain. Clara held his hand throughout, her grip tight. When Hart finished, she bandaged the shoulder herself, wrapping clean cloth with careful precision. "Short stitches," Tahoma advised, watching her work through pain-glazed eyes. "I know," she said. "You already told me once. Wanted to make sure you remembered." She finished the bandage, tied it off. Her hands trembled slightly now that the immediate danger was past. Tahoma reached up with his good hand and steadied her wrist. "You did well," he said quietly. "You saved my life. You saved mine first, multiple times." She looked at him, really looked at him. "I think we're even." "We're partners," he said. "Partners don't keep score." Outside, Hoxila and Little Crow were securing Coulter and Doolin in a wagon under heavy guard. A federal marshal would arrive from the capital within days, but they couldn't risk the prisoners escaping before then. Huxila assigned 4 warriors to watch them day and night. Martha Bell and the townspeople gathered evidence, the dry plate Silas's camera, and testimony, the burned remains of ledgers that still showed enough to prove guilt. Martha's journal entries provided timelines that matched everything. Samuel Pike stood over his father's body, face streaked with tears and dirt. Hart approached carefully. "Your father died protecting what was right. That takes courage." "He died because of me," Samuel said bitterly. "Because I worked for Maddox. Because I was too scared to stand up." "He died because evil men do evil things," Hart corrected gently. "You're 16. You were trying to save your family? No shame in that. The shame is on Maddox and Coulter, not you. What happens to my ma, to our farm? The debt dies with Maddox. His estate will be seized, but your father's loan is void. The farm belongs to your family, free and clear." Hart squeezed the boy's shoulder. "Your father made sure of that with his last act." Samuel nodded, wiping his face. Then he did something unexpected. He walked over to where Sheriff Doolin sat in shackles, trying to look defiant. "I have something you need to see," Samuel said. He pulled a folded paper from inside his shirt. It was an invoice he'd found while delivering paperwork to the rail office weeks ago. He'd kept it, not sure what it meant. Now he understood. He handed it to Hart. Hart unfolded it carefully. It was stamped with Maddox's railroad seal, dated 2 years earlier. The item listed, "Canvas coats modified for military use. Payment arrangement by Sheriff E. Doolin." This was the final piece. Proof that Doolin had helped purchase the disguises for the staged raids. He'd known everything from the beginning. Hart showed the invoice to the gathered townspeople. Doolin's face went white. He tried to run, shackles and all, hobbling toward a horse. Samuel stepped into his path, picked up a shovel leaning against a fence, and blocked him. "No more running," Samuel said, voice hard despite his tears. "My pa died because of you. You don't get to run." Doolin stopped. His shoulders sagged. The deputies grabbed him, secured heavier chains. The evidence was complete now. Airtight. Undeniable. That evening, as the sun set red and angry over the prairie, Tahoma and Clara sat outside Hart's clinic. Too much had happened inside for him to rest comfortably. He needed airspace, sky. Clara sat beside him on the porch steps, close but not touching. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now Huxila escorts Coulter and Doolin to the capital for trial. Silas testifies. The dry plate, the invoice, Martha's journal, it all goes before a federal judge." Tahoma shifted, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. "Justice. The kind that lasts. And you. I'll testify too. For Winyan. For all of them." He paused. "After that, I don't know." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They want me to run the telegraph again. Honestly, this time. Help rebuild communications. Will you, if you think I should?" He looked at her, confused. "Why does my opinion matter?" "Because I'm asking." She met his eyes directly. "Should I stay?" He understood then what she was really asking. "Yes," he said simply. "Stay. Will you come back after the trial?" "Do you want me to?" "Yes," she said, echoing his own word. They sat in silence as darkness fell. Later they slept in the clinic's back room, her on the examination table, him on blankets on the floor because his shoulder couldn't tolerate the narrow cot. But in the middle of the night, when nightmares woke her, she came and lay down beside him, back to back, sharing warmth and presence, and the unspoken comfort of not being alone. At dawn, they walked the riverbank together, moving slowly because of his injuries. They didn't talk much. Words weren't necessary anymore. The connection between them had been forged in fire and blood and absolute trust. It didn't need explanation. 3 weeks later, with spring rains breaking the drought at last, Wildflower held a public hearing in the rail yard. Marshal Graves took sworn depositions under federal authority before removal to the territorial court for indictment. The depot was still burned, but the platform had been cleared and reinforced. Benches were set up for townspeople. A federal marshal arrived from the capital, a stern man in his 50s, named Graves, accompanied by 2 clerks to record testimony. The hearing lasted all morning. Martha Bell stood before the crowd and read from her journal in her clear, steady voice. She recounted smoke signals, telegraph closures, suspicious arrivals, and departures. Her entries matched the massacre dates exactly down to the hour. Dr. Hart testified about injuries he'd treated that didn't match hostile attacks, bullet wounds from military carbines, burns consistent with staged fires, timing that made no sense if the raids were genuine. He presented medical records that contradicted official Army reports point by point. Silas Rudd showed his camera to the crowd, explained how Coulter had hired him to photograph fake raids. He named names, provided dates, described in painful detail how the private auxiliaries, dressed as settlers to attack native camps. His voice shook, but never faltered. His testimony was damning detailed, impossible to refute. Huxila spoke for the Lakota band, presenting the dry plate as evidence, and demanding that Winyan's death and the deaths of 6 others in that raid be recognized as murder, not warfare. He spoke in Lakota first, then English, his words measured and powerful. The crowd listened in complete silence. Samuel Pike testified about the invoice he'd found, about the pressure Maddox had put on his family, about the fear that had kept people quiet for so long. He cried when he talked about his father's last stand. No one looked away. Tahoma testified last. He spoke about Winyan, her laugh, her skill with beadwork, the way she'd loved horses and open sky. He spoke about finding the inconsistencies, following the cold trail, learning that her death had been staged by men who wanted land and profit. He showed the beaded hair tie, explained how finding it in the photograph had changed everything. "I wanted revenge," he said quietly. But revenge would have solved nothing. Justice is what honors the dead. Truth is what prevents this from happening again. Marshal Graves ruled that Captain Ezra Coulter and Sheriff Emmett Doolin would stand federal trial on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Both men were remanded to federal custody immediately. Maddox's estate would be investigated and likely seized. His railroad contracts were voided pending review. The land grants he'd stolen would be returned to their rightful owners, both settlers and Lakota band territory. Ephraim Pike would be buried with full honors, his farm debt-free, and transferred to his widow. His death was ruled a murder committed by James Maddox, who had already paid with his life. The townspeople agreed to testify at the capital trial. Martha Hart Silas, Samuel Clara, all of them committed to seeing this through to the end. When the hearing concluded, the crowd dispersed slowly. There was no celebration, too many had died. But there was satisfaction. Justice had been served. Truth had won. Tahoma stood with Huxila near the horses, preparing for the journey to the capital. Coulter sat in shackles in a reinforced wagon, guarded by 2 federal deputies and 4 of Huxila's warriors. The captain's face was pale, his wounded hand wrapped in dirty bandages. He looked diminished now, just a man who'd made terrible choices and would pay for them. Clara approached, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Supplies for the journey. Dried meat, hardtack coffee. The good kind Hart keeps hidden. Thank you. Tahoma took the bundle. Their fingers brushed briefly that familiar spark of connection. "How long will you be gone?" she asked. 3 weeks, maybe 4 depending on the trial. She nodded, looking at the ground. Will you come back? He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Do you want me to? She met his eyes. Yes, I do. Huxila cleared his throat, a subtle reminder that others were watching, waiting. This wasn't the time or place for lengthy farewells. Frontier propriety required reserve, especially between unmarried people. Tahoma stepped closer to Clara, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I'll bring a real cook pot next time. Something better than what we used in that mine. A small smile touched her lips, the first real smile he'd seen from her in days. I'll keep the fire steady. Simple words. Practical words. But they carried the weight of promise, of commitment, of a future being carefully, realistically built. Tahoma reached into the leather pouch at his belt and pulled out Winyan's beaded hair tie. Clara had cleaned it carefully after the hearing, and the red and white beads gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. He held it for a moment, remembering his sister, her laugh, her kindness, her too short life. Then he offered it to Clara. For you, to remember that truth matters, that standing up to evil matters, even when it's hard. She took it carefully, reverently. I'll keep it safe. I know you will. Before mounting his horse, he adjusted the bandage on Clara's hand. One last time, her palms were still healing from the rains and rocks and rough work. His palm rested warmly on her fingers for a moment longer than strictly necessary. A moment of connection, of intimacy earned through survival and sacrifice. Take care of yourself, he said quietly. You too. Come back whole. He swung onto his horse, grimacing slightly as his injured shoulder took weight. Clara handed him the supply bundle. He secured it, then looked down at her one more time. The telegraph office, he said. Keep it honest. The territory needs that. I will. And when you come back? She paused. There'll be a place for you here, if you want it. It was as close as frontier propriety allowed to a declaration. He understood what she was offering. Not romance, not yet, maybe never in the flowery sense. But partnership, belonging, a future built on solid ground rather than desperate circumstances. I'll want it, he said simply. She nodded, stepped back from his horse. The caravan began to move, Huxila leading the prisoner wagon in the middle, warriors flanking Tahoma at the rear. As they rode past the telegraph office, he turned to look back one last time. Clara stood on the porch, one hand raised in farewell. The beaded hair tie was wrapped around her wrist. She didn't lower her hand until they disappeared from view. The town was healing already. The drought had broken, real rain falling regularly, now turning brown earth green again. The telegraph office would reopen within a week, with Clara running honest communications. Martha Bell continued teaching her journal, now a historical record that would be studied for years. Dr. Hart treated his patients with renewed energy, his clinic busier than ever, as people returned to rebuild. Samuel Pike planted crops that spring on land that was finally legally his family's. He worked hard, carrying his father's memory in every furrow plowed, every seed planted. Little Crow returned to Huxila's band, carrying news of the successful hearing. The Lakota would not face false accusations from this territory again. The band's land was protected, recognized by federal decree. Silas Rudd, after testifying at the federal trial, left the territory to start fresh in California. His camera and remaining photographs were donated to the territorial archives as evidence of the corruption that had been exposed and defeated. 4 weeks later, exactly 4 weeks, Tahoma returned to Wildflower. He rode into town on a warm afternoon, a new iron cookpot tied to his saddle, and a letter from the federal marshal in his pocket. The trial had concluded. Coulter and Doolin were convicted on all charges, sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Their careers, their reputations, their freedom all destroyed. Clara was working in the telegraph office when she heard the horse approach. She looked out the window and saw him dismounting, still favoring his left side slightly, but moving with purpose and strength. She stepped onto the porch, smoothing her dress, a new one, dark blue calico, purchased with her first honest wages. He walked toward her, carrying the cookpot. "You came back?" she said. "I said I would." He held out the pot. "For steady fires and honest work." She took it, fingers brushing his. "I kept it ready." They stood there for a moment, two people who'd survived hell together and chosen each other not through romantic fantasy, but through proven trust, mutual respect, and the quiet certainty that came from facing death side by side and deciding life was better together. "Stay for supper?" she asked. "I'd like that, if the invitation stands." "It does, for as long as you want." He followed her inside. The telegraph office was clean and orderly, equipment repaired and humming with proper use. Messages came and went, honest communications connecting honest people. Clara set the cookpot on the stove and began preparing coffee and a simple meal. Tahoma sat at the table watching her move around the small space. She'd gained weight, not much, but enough that she no longer looked half-starved. Her hands had healed, though scars remained. She moved with confidence, now no longer hiding, no longer afraid. "The marshal's letter says you can stay if you want," Clara said, pouring coffee. "Hoxila negotiated it. You're officially a territorial witness under federal protection. That means Wildflower is safe for you." "And if I want to stay for other reasons?" he asked. She set the coffee cup in front of him, met his eyes. "Then you stay for those reasons." They ate together as the sun set, simple food, quiet conversation about small things. The rebuilt telegraph lines, the spring planting, Hoxila's band settling peacefully on newly protected land. Martha Bell's plans to write a proper history of what happened. Dr. Hart's hope to expand his clinic. When darkness fell, Tahoma stood to leave. Clara walked him to the door. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked. "And the day after," he said, "if you'll have me." "I will." He touched her face briefly, his calloused palm gentle against her cheek, a thumb brushing near her mouth. A touch of affection, of promise, appropriate for the frontier and the slow building of something that might, in time, become love. Then he went to the boarding house where he'd rented a room. But the next day he came back. And the day after that. And the day after that. Within a month, the townspeople had accepted him. Within 3 months, he was helping Hart at the clinic using traditional Lakota medicine knowledge, alongside Hart's training, a partnership that saved lives and built bridges. Within 6 months, he and Clara had an understanding. Not marriage yet, frontier courtships moved slowly, deliberately, with community observation and approval. But commitment, partnership, the knowledge that they'd found something rare and valuable and worth protecting. The story of Tahoma and Clara would continue for years, not as a wild romance, but as a steady partnership built on the solid ground of shared hardship and mutual choice. They would face the future together, two survivors who'd found each other in chaos and decided to stay. The truth had been revealed. The guilty had been punished. The innocent had been vindicated. And in a harsh land where survival was never guaranteed, two people had found something worth fighting for, each other